Breaking news today on Sekulow as Biden's Border Patrol chief is forced to resign. And what did President Xi and President Biden talk about with U.S.-China relations? We'll break it all down for you. Rick Rinnell's going to be joining us, so we want you to be part of the show today.
Keeping you informed and engaged, now more than ever. This is Sekulow. We want to hear from you. Share and post your comments or call 1-800-684-3110. And now your host, Jordan Sekulow.
So President Biden's Customs and Border Patrol chief, head of the CBP, forced to resign. At first he wasn't going to. Then he was forced out. And ultimately here, shouldn't it be Mayorkas? I mean, he's the boss. This is the team he assembled. They assembled someone without the experience. He came from local law enforcement, was a hard D, didn't support the border policies of the previous administration. They bring him to Washington, D.C. to run a gigantic agency, and guess what? He's failed miserably. But he's failed miserably over the last 2 years. So this is politics at play here.
Absolutely.
For instance, CBP encountered 98 individuals attempting to illegally cross in between ports of entry on the terror watch list this last year, fiscal year. The CBP seized a record number of 15,000 pounds of fentanyl last fiscal year alone. That's enough to kill every man, woman, and child in the United States 10 times. So he didn't get fired then. CBP saw a record 856 migrants last fiscal year who were abandoned by human smugglers and died. So the human casualty there. And there have been 7 consecutive months and 9 total months last year where migrant encounters exceeded 200,000. In September, CBP saw a staggering 227,000 migrant encounters, another historic record. So he is gone. Congress, again, we're still working on the shakeup of how Congress is going to look. Logan, we, as of today, Monday, still don't know.
Still don't know. You know, if you flipped on the news, you would think this was Wednesday morning. You would think that we were still discussing, oh, look at the numbers that are coming in. It is shocking. It's upsetting that we don't know. And, look, we have to be honest, it's shocking and upsetting some of the ways these elections have been turning out. We need to at least be keenly aware of why and what's happening.
Yeah, we can go through that learning process of what needs to change so that Republicans can, again, win, basically.
That's how it feels. I mean, at least win decisively. You could say that really, truly, I mean, other than a couple known entities or known states that are just very hard red, like in Alabama, any of the ones that were toss-ups were at least very close and too close and too comfortable for that. When you look at that, when you look at really, Florida is the only place that was kind of shockingly definitive. And this is should be a big concern to everybody. We should be looking at it, and not just, I'm not talking about the integrity of the election. I'm talking about the way that this all shaked out, the way the votes came in, who voted, how they voted, the demographics, engaging culture, what we need to do to potentially, if you're a conservative, potentially have a little bit more definitive of victories.
Yeah, I mean, we want to win, right? I mean, that's the ultimate goal here is winning, not just putting forward candidates we like, but candidates that we like that can win in these election cycles. So we have a lot more to talk about that today on the broadcast. Rick Rinnell is going to be joining us on the broadcast, too, to break down, of course, President Biden having his first face-to-face meeting with President Xi, so we'll get into some of that. But the border issue, how important is this to you at 1-800-684-3110? I mean, I just read you that fact that last year alone, enough fentanyl seized to kill every one of us in the United States, man, woman, and child, 10 times. Not one time over, 10 times. Like the end of the United States of America. That's how much fentanyl has crossed over our southern border. And we're talking about what they've seized. What about what they haven't been able to seize? We know they haven't seized it all because people are dying up from fentanyl all across the country at all these times. So we want to hear those stories from you. Is fentanyl impacting your family? Is it impacting your community? This is an issue where, regardless of how the balance of power shakes up, we have got to do a better job as Americans to protect our fellow Americans, especially young people. Give us a call, 1-800-684-3110. That's 1-800-684-3110. And do you think we'll know by the end of this week, who controls the House?
President Biden's border security guard being warned to step down or be fired after a tumultuous first year on the job.
But in a letter, Commissioner Chris Magnus is not complying. He says, I want to make this clear. I have no plans to resign as CBP commissioner. I didn't take this job as a resume builder. I came to Washington, D.C., moved my family here because I care about this agency, its mission, and the goals of this administration.
Chris Magnus has only been in this position for about 11 months. Well, when we talk about what we have seen over the last 11 months, we've seen about 2.5 million people cross through our southern border illegally, again, under his watch. And that is something that, of course, officials within the White House, within DHS are looking at.
This is another example of Mayorkas' failed leadership. He's a coward because he thinks the Republicans are going to take back Congress. There's going to be investigations on the border, and Magnus is going to be a throwaway.
Men and women at CBP that have taken an oath, they want action. They don't need this distraction. We need a plan for the border. We need to secure that border, and he has failed to do it.
The head of U.S. Customs and Border Protection has resigned from his job at a time when record numbers of migrants are entering the United States from Mexico.
They don't want him testifying before a Republican Congress. That's why they're doing this. They're pushing him out of the way. They were perfectly happy with him sleeping in meetings, not doing anything. This has just come up right now.
For whatever reason, whatever the justification, he serves at the pleasure of the president.
Sure.
We're not talking about the border here. We're not talking about the men and women of CBP who took an oath and are dedicated to securing the border. We're now being distracted by rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Alejandro Mayorkas is the architect of this failed border policy. He needs to be impeached. And that's just the bottom line. And this shows he's gutless. He's a coward for throwing on Magnus, who, again, was worthless too. But to throw it on him when this was his plan, everybody did exactly what he wanted him to do.
All right, welcome back to Sekulow. We are taking your phone calls to 1-800-684-3110. So you have the head of Customs and Border Patrol out, forced to resign. He didn't want to, then he was forced out to resign. They're using him as the fall guy, Logan. I mean, the truth is, he was implementing the policies of the Biden administration. He was implementing the policies of Secretary Mayorkas at DHS, who oversees this agency. So, yes, he's bad, and he should go, but this is not the end of the problem because still Mayorkas at the very top. I hope Republicans take back the House so that we can have real oversight hearings so we can secure our border and stop the murder of so many Americans across the country because of fentanyl, which, by the way, the ingredients come from China. They're packaged together then in Latin America and trafficked over our border.
Well, hopefully it means they're starting to take it a little more seriously too, right? Does that mean that the Biden administration actually stepping up and saying, hey, we know this is a real problem, and sure, we got after the midterms, maybe we're going to come in and actually do something about it? Or who forced him, if you want to say, to
I'm nervous that they forced him out just so he doesn't have to testify.
Okay. So
he can still have to testify, but it's different when you're not the actual official. And so Mayorkas is going to have to testify, but he'll put in a new CBP person who then's got to get up to speed, and they got to figure out their thing. So then,
it delays a lot.
Yes, it delays a lot. And listen, let me just be very honest, as we always are in this broadcast. While it looks still like it favors Republicans to take the House, there are 19 outstanding House seats. Right now it stands the Democrats have 204, Republicans have 212. That means they need at least 6 of those 19 outstanding. So that statistically would favor the Republicans there. But no one is willing to call that. No one is really.
Yeah, the fact you haven't had that. We all got the push notification of Democrats retain the Senate.
Right.
We haven't gotten the Republicans take the House. And that is definitely, obviously it's the media, but that's something to be concerned about when we are this close. And some of these elections are hundreds of votes. You're not talking about even thousands.
It's about recounts.
You're gonna have this could go on and on and on and on. I think we now have to start pacing ourselves. That's why we've moved into some different content even here. Because now when you flip over to CNN and they're still showing the graphics of who won, it's kind of nauseating.
Yeah.
I think we have to move on with our lives, come up and tell you about all the other stuff that's happening. It's very important, whether it's Biden meeting with Xi or whatever's happening around the world, really. We're going to talk and we're going to switch topics a few times today while still letting you know what's going on.
Yeah, of course. I want to take this call, 1-800-684-3110, while we're talking about the voting. Steve in Pennsylvania online, too. Hey, Steve.
Gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon. Appreciate the program. Thank you for what you do.
Thank you.
Just a quick question. I'd like to get your input on it. It just seems like when these elections are delayed, the results seem to favor Democrats generally. I mean, there was Laxalt in Nevada, was ahead almost up to the 11th hour, and for some reason they find just a few extra votes, and the Democrat wins as a senator. So what's your insight on that?
What I'm seeing there is that in the counties that count votes the slowest, they're the largest counties usually in the state. So, yes, there's some rural areas. I know in like Bobert's race, that's an issue because it's a huge district. There's a lot of rural voting. That's one thing. But in these statewide elections, where do you go to? We go to Philadelphia. You look at you look at places like Maricopa. They take the longest to vote, and they have the heaviest amount of Democrat votes. So there's a twofold there. You get in a lot of Republican votes that kind of start meeting the Democrat votes that already came in through other counties. And then you got to wait, like Kerry Lake is still waiting, how this is all going to break down in Maricopa, because a lot of the votes left were same-day voters who dropped off absentees, so they're thinking, are those Republican? So this, again, I think we need some reforms so that we're not the laughingstock of the world. I was talking to some folks this weekend who are from Canada. They said they used to like to tune in to watch our election night. Now they don't anymore after last time because they've given it a couple times.
There's no reason.
The fact that you can't get an idea of who's going to control Congress, you turn it off. And the rest of the world, what do you think world leaders are thinking when we still don't know the balance of power in Congress? It makes their job actually very difficult to plan for who they're going to be dealing with when it comes to a co-equal branch of government, the legislative branch. So I think, again, we've got to see reforms. We also need to start taking advantage. I will preach this and preach this and preach this. We must start taking advantage of early voting, and that should begin with the Walker race in Georgia. We cannot start every election night 70% down, where we're just waiting for these counters to come in and give us blocks of votes that help us catch up. It's like, even though technically you're not playing catch up because all the votes are there,
it feels that way.
It feels like we're always starting from behind, and then we barely have these leads, and then they then dump in a major Democrat county.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is very important.
I don't think there's been any allegations of major fraud, anything like that. This is just a very bad counting process.
Yeah, absolutely. Should we take some other calls?
Sure.
Let's go to John, who's calling in Kentucky. John, you're on the air.
Brothers, how you guys doing today?
Hey, we're good.
Good. Hey, I've been keeping an eye on this whole thing with the drugs coming across the board. I work for a faith-based drug and alcohol treatment facility, and the increases in numbers for doses and people looking for treatment has just been insane. And I know there's going to be a lot of people that think with the border that a lot of that would be happening at the border, but I was looking at some of the statistics and just looking at where a lot of this is happening. Your top 5 states, we're number 2 on the list, West Virginia, number 1, Delaware, Ohio, and Tennessee. And now with this people being flown to different areas of the country, it's just spreading like wildfire, man. And for all of our treatment facilities that are trying to help aid this epidemic, it's sad.
It is sad. And that's because we've said on this broadcast, when you have this kind of mass influx of people, Logan, and drugs and trafficking, every state becomes a border state.
This has nothing to do with, it does have to do with the border, but it's going everywhere. And once it gets out to the country, it's everywhere.
The drugs.
Yeah, absolutely. So to secure the border is to hopefully stop this from getting into your country. Because once it's here, we all know how the system works. You can get anything to anywhere within hours in our country.
And I want people to know that we've got an ACLJ FOIA on this, demanding answers on President Biden's border policies. I think we'll be able to utilize this, hopefully a House majority, to even get to the bottom of more of this. But we're in a document production phase right now, and we're ensuring that we will hold this administration accountable. You might not like what you find out, but we're going to find out why they're just okay with this amount of drugs crossing our border without putting why do they want to hire more IRS agents instead of more Customs and Border Patrol agents who can help stop this flow of illegal, not just illegal drugs, these are deadly illegal drugs. These drugs kill
the
you.
The most deadly.
The most deadly we've ever seen.
Yeah, this is not just about even you ingesting it. There's
it's not like opioid addiction where some of that can be treated.
Yeah,
you
or
get
over
too
time.
much fentanyl, you die.
Yeah, or if and we've had cases where people get sick or die from not doing drugs, from encountering it, or being
just touching
near it, touching it, children touching it.
Police officers who are patting down a drug dealer and go into some kind of shock have to use those narc pins on them. I mean, we've seen it. We know it's true. So we have to take care of it. We're not a functioning country if we allow that kind of deadly drug to be spreading all across, and it's affecting kids, high school students. People think that they're taking, a Xanax, and it's actually fentanyl, and they're dead. Their parents are walking to their bedroom, finding their kids dead. It is no joke, and it should not be about partisan politics. It should be about saving our country, getting us out of this huge epidemic. We're always going to have to deal with drugs and issues like that. It's part of being in a big country. But this drug needs to be eradicated. We need to do as best we can to eradicate its illegal use.
Yeah, absolutely. If there's ways you can do it, we're going to look into those more and more. Because as you see, elections maybe not going necessarily in the way you'd like them to, even when there are these crises. There are other ways to act, and we have the ACLJ here to come up with those ways, to work with people to get there. It is important.
I just want to encourage people to know that we're doing work on this. We might be doing more work on a lot of this depending on how the House shakes up. But right now, the ACLJ team is not giving up. We don't give up. We continue to fight. And we are fighting to get answers on fentanyl. We are fighting to get answers on our porous southern border. We're doing it through FOIA. And if we can't get it through FOIA, where there's a production of documents coming this week, if we aren't satisfied there, we will go to federal court to get the information the public deserves. We are able to do that because of your support of the American Center for Law and Justice at aclj.org. I mean, Logan, that's why this is a critical time. We got a matching challenge. I know people are hurting financially, but the way the matching challenge works is if somebody had to cut their donation and say, I can't give $50 this month, but I can give $25. Well, the matching challenge, that equivalently is like giving $50.
Right. There are donors on the other side who have pledged to match donations this month. So right now, like Jordan said, for the ACLJ, if you give $25, that effectively becomes $50. You only get charged $25. There's another person out there ready to match. They match that $25, and that is donated to the organization. So you can do that right now, and there's not a special way to do it. Anything you have to do, you just have to make the donation on aclj.org. All donations are effectively doubled. Again, you don't get charged the double. Someone else is picking that up and matching what you make. So that is great. If you can, we obviously understand, as Jordan said, we understand it's a very hard time for people. So we understand some of you cannot. But if you have the opportunity, as we head to the end of the year, it's a great time to do it. Go to aclj.org. Just go to aclj.org, not only to donate, but look at the incredible content that's on the website.
The Freedom of Information Act allows people to petition their government and ask for the background information as to why they came to a certain decision.
It's thousands of pages of paper, and in those thousands of pages of paper, you usually find a nugget.
We are entitled as citizens of the United States to know about how our government works.
Government agencies acting out of control.
They want to keep Americans in the dark. That's why it's incredibly important to have the ACLJ constantly pushing to find out what the background information is.
Do you remember the Iran deal? There was a video about what took place on that deal, and it was edited. And the edit took out the key part of what was going on. State Department, White House, editing videos to keep it from the American public.
We have exposed that in our FOIA litigation, and we do that every day that we bring these cases.
We took it to the IRS. No one ever does that. And because of it, it's a very weak government agency that used to be the scary government agency.
What the IRS was doing was violating the Constitution and statutory law. Because of the litigation we engaged in, it's a different agency. They can't do what they were doing before.
We've got the declassified list of Obama administration officials who started asking to unmask. They've been hiding behind in the shadows. These FOIAs bring them to light.
All of this information came because we went to court to get the information.
The power of Washington, D.C. only works when the rest of us, the rest of Americans, are kept in the dark.
We may find one item of information in thousands of documents of irrelevancies, but we persist and we're on it every day of our lives.
The work that the ACLJ does matters. It matters to policymakers. It matters to ordinary citizens all across America.
Those of you that support the ACLJ, this is what it's all about at the end of the day.
Think we haven't been on this, folks? We've been on it. All right, welcome back to Sekulow. We continue to take your phone calls as well, 1-800-684-3110. We're going to shift into a little talk because President Biden had his first meeting with face-to-face with President Xi of China. We're going to talk about that with Rick Riddell, too. But let me take Tim's call on line 3. Hey, Tim.
Thank you for taking my call. Do you think that the talks that President Biden had with President Xi are exactly identical for the talks he had with Putin?
I mean, I don't know if it's exactly identical because there's different issues at play, intellectual property issues, some business issues. What didn't come up was COVID. We know that.
Yeah, kind of the big one.
Kind of a big one.
Yeah, ridiculous.
What they talked about was to prevent nuclear war in Ukraine. Okay, that's understandable. That's an issue. But to ignore COVID is not right. He did bring up their human rights treatment, which is good. But again, we reaffirmed the one China policy, which is that confusing policy that we believe in this one China policy. We also defend Taiwan aggressively. Leaving out COVID to me means the whole meeting was wasted.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad he brought up the human rights
thing. Just a
thing.
wasted opportunity.
It is
to put him on the spot.
Well, this is what happened when he met with the Crown Prince. The big ones that come up, they kind of casually get avoid. I do like that he brought up the human rights crisis. Obviously, we've all been talking about that for years in terms of China. However, if you don't bring up COVID and really something that's still affecting people everywhere, 3 years later, like you said, what's the point?
Yeah, well, listen to President Biden. He's excited about working with China to solve global issues like climate change. Bite 8.
It was also clear that China and the United States should be able to work together where we can to solve global challenges that require every nation to do its part. We discussed Russia's aggression against Ukraine, reaffirmed our shared belief in the threat where the use of nuclear weapons is totally unacceptable, and I asked that Secretary Blinken travel to China to follow up on our discussions and continue keeping the lines of communication open between our two countries.
You know, it's just, are we not dealing with the China that we should be dealing with, which is an enemy? I know we have to be careful because we have a lot of economic interest.
Yeah, you can't cut China off.
But the soft glove approach is a little too soft for me. Like, we can work together. We can do things great. China is working against us everywhere they can, including in our own country. They're buying up land in our own country. The idea that he had this opportunity to sit down and say, COVID, never again, okay? Your labs, never again. You cannot, and you deserve to have to somehow be punished
some kind
for
of
what you unleashed
sanction
on the world.
Or financial something, because it is...
1 million Americans died.
Yeah, but not even brought up. Not even brought up. Not even a topic of...
Talks about Russians and Ukrainians, but what about the millions of Americans who died because of COVID? What about all of them, President Biden? Why forget? Or are you just not tough enough to bring it up to President Xi face-to-face? Because I know former presidents who would have been tough enough to bring it up to them. Why not you? Is it the business dealings in China? Is it just the reliance? Is our economy teetering on the edge so bad that we can't do anything that would possibly... I mean, that's sad, too. If our economy is in such a bad shape that we are that reliant on China that we can't anger them at all, then we are in a very tough diplomatic state. I'll talk about it with Rick.
I don't think that's necessarily inaccurate. I think we are pretty beholden to China in terms of manufacturing, in terms of a lot of things. So there is this big problem. Look, I think that you're right that it's not the way it should be, but it is the reality. It's the reality that China, somewhat, we have no choice at right now. I mean, we really don't. We don't have a choice to work with them, or else. I mean, you talk about economic collapse that unlike anything we've ever seen.
Yeah.
So I get it in some sense because you can't just cut off China, and but that doesn't mean they can't suffer some consequences for COVID or the humanitarian problems that they've had for decades.
We'll take some calls, too, on election stuff. We're trying to cover everything we can today to get you back up to speed on
not just our election, but also what's going on around the world, like President Biden. But listen, Americans are still trying to figure out what is going to happen with the balance of power in the House. Now we know the Senate is done, but the House. Mary in Arizona on line 4. Hey, Mary.
Hey. Hi. Hey, thanks for taking my call. I just was calling in to pass on my little bit of intel. I worked the polls starting at the very early hours on Election Day and witnessed constant shenanigans that moved. And, of course, you have to be careful not to say fraud. But the machine polls were breaking down. The machines themselves, were breaking down, as were people. When you go in to vote, it kept spitting them out. And this took over the period of time, a couple hours, at least in the morning. And I only worked the morning shift till noon, and then I don't know what happened after that. But constant breakdown. So I just wanted to pass that on.
Unacceptable. Mary, you work the polls, your civic duty to do that. And I appreciate you doing that. And you go there, and the machines just don't work. Like they didn't test. There was a primary. Did they not test?
I mean, they claim they did. Everything worked fine. But it ended up being, allegedly, at least what they said, an issue with the ink in the printer.
Not being dark enough.
Something like that. It wasn't putting out enough ink for it to be read.
The machine before you put it through the reader.
Right, yeah. It's like a paper ballot that's digitally read.
It's just unacceptable in the United States of America.
I think for a lot of these, I'm looking at all the elections across the country. There are so many, not just the big ticket ones we've been talking about. There's so many that have not been called yet, or even sent to a runoff or sent to a recount. That you go, wow, this is how has it gotten worse? This much worse,
right? And it has.
It definitely has. I mean, it wasn't like this before. Elections were mostly decided in the wee hours of the evening for the big ones, for the presidential. And even when it wasn't, even if it went to something like a Bush v. Gore or it went to the next day, it wasn't typically weeks or months. We kind of said it could go into December. I mean, we're halfway through November at this point. That's not unlikely. I mean, we obviously know Georgia will go into December because of the runoff, but even these ones that are still tracking, not 100% of the votes tabulated, in nearly a week in, it's really wild. And I'm sick of looking it up. I'm sick of looking up the results in Arizona. I'm sick of looking. I think a lot of people, it's happening. You're getting fatigued.
I'll tell you how it impacts our planning ACLJ. We want to host new members in our ACLJ DC office so that, again, because they're going in there, they're trying to put together a staff, learn about, especially if they're brand new to Washington. Yeah. And they don't even know if they're going to be in the majority or the minority. And there's a big difference. Are you going to be on as many committees? Who's going to be chairing the committees? Is Nancy Pelosi going to be the Speaker of the House? Potentially still.
Yeah, but I mean, folks, last week we were pretty much saying it's virtually impossible. And now the possibilities are creeping and creeping.
That's what I say. It's creeping up.
Yeah, I mean, it's still unlikely.
Still unlikely. I don't want to, put that alarm on yet. But Chuck Schumer's going to stay in power. That's 100%. And I also want to ask you this, too, on the politics. Because we know now the Senate has gone to the Democrats, are you going to be able to get as excited about the Herschel runoff in Georgia? Are you going to donate? Are you even going to think about making a trip down to help volunteer? Or are you just kind of down on where Republicans obviously did not have a great plan this election cycle? 1-800-684-3110 is the number to call. That's 1-800-684-3110. But know this, at the ACLJ, we fight. Doesn't matter who's in the White House. Doesn't matter who controls Congress. We're there to fight for you. Support our work. Be part of our matching challenge. Donate today.
keeping you informed and engaged. Now more than ever. This is Sekulow. And now your host, Jordan Sekulow.
I think it's fair to say, too, we need to do a little political update. We've kind of been throwing it in and out throughout the broadcast today, but I want to make it clear to people about where things stand. The Republicans have lost the Senate. It does not matter what happens in the runoff with Herschel. It'd be great to add another Republican to the U.S. Senate, but because of Vice President Harris, they're there.
It's not as consequential as
No.
it would have been. It was going to be the deciding factor, and now we know it is not.
And the question is,
decision's
will they
been
even need Vice President Harris? Because if Herschel doesn't win, is that right, Will? If
Yeah.
Herschel doesn't win,
You don't
Vice
need a
President Harris
breaker.
won't have to be that tie-breaking vote. It will not be a divided Senate. So we will actually have done worse.
Something you got to think about, and we've been talking about all weekend is what we've done wrong, what not we, I'm going to say what really the Republican Party, I would say has done wrong. The system, the man, what have they done wrong in terms of how you reach people? And you can't look at it and go, look, it's very close. Everywhere is incredibly close.
Yeah, we didn't get killed.
No, and I'd say there weren't many places you got killed. It was all really, like you said, which way did that small percentage of undecided voters?
They went Democrat.
Yeah, they all went Democrat pretty much. I mean, for a large portion of them. So if that's the case, how do you then, when you see that the next generation, the Gen Zers, are voting? So now, obviously, people grow up, they get a little more conservative with age. It's just, just the truth. But with them breaking so far to the left, how do you appeal at all? And how do you maintain where this just doesn't become a 100% country ruled by extreme leftists? And I think there has to be some way back. There has to be some conversations that can be had. There has to be a few places that we can find agreements on, or else, and we have to embrace the way that they operate.
Yes.
We made fun of a lot of the social media stuff that the Democrats have done, whether it's the people that they allowed in the White House and the way they reacted with sketches and comedy and all of that. And look, do I think it was right to make fun of them? I think they were ridiculous. But I'm closer to 40 than I am to 20 by a lot.
You're a
I'm
different
closer to
voting
50 than I'm 20. I'm a different voting block. I am not of the TikTok generation. I am not of that kind of world. I grew up with the internet. I grew up with social media.
Yeah.
But I don't understand the influencer culture like a lot of Democrats do. And a lot of younger people do.
They put money behind it.
They put money behind the right people to get the message across. And it's the reason the influencer word, which sounds like a dirty word, exists is because why? They are influencing. They are influencing culture to the extreme. What we did is we took our conservative influencers and really kind of completely forgot they existed. And I will even say that somewhat to how they treat social media platforms in general. Not just even stuff like our show. Sure, plenty of people have come on and have been guests, and that's great. But there are quite a few that still will say no.
Yeah.
They don't understand the reach. They don't understand the millions of people that watch and listen every day because we're not on traditional Fox News. We're not on traditional forms of television. We're reaching a different audience. But they're so stuck in their ways that they can't break from it, and all they can do is ridicule the reason they lost.
Yeah. And I want to say this, too, because I'm seeing in the chat. I think where we saw the economy be the number one issue and abortion be number two, okay? Abortion number two, that does not help Republicans, okay? So,
no.
That was not, the fact that that silent vote was there, it wasn't the majority, but it was the number two. Okay, so that hurt Republicans. But number one, I think we actually got hurt on the economy. And here's my pitch on that, the more I thought about it. Because I was thinking, like, how did this be people say the economy's going in the wrong direction?
We're doing a good job, yeah.
Going in the wrong direction, and I'm going to vote on the economy. You know what I think it is? People want the handouts. People want the $1,500 check.
Yeah, they like that.
And guess who doesn't write the $1,500 checks?
Yeah.
Republicans. Guess who does? Democrats.
They like the presents.
They like the free checks, the free money. Even though that increases inflation, they're short-term thinking about this. The short-term thinking is, I'm having trouble buying food, trouble buying gas. Do I give my vote over to these Republicans who are saying they want to cut all those programs? Or are we at an economic point where a lot of voters are saying, I don't love the Democrats, but at least it's likely that if they get in power, I get another bailout check. And I think that that's a real issue we have to deal with. Rick Riddell's coming up next. Support the work of the ACLJ at aclj.org. That's aclj.org.
come face to face. Joe Biden and Xi Jinping in a high stakes meeting. Both leaders stressing the importance of cooperation in their opening remarks. Listen.
As the leaders of our two nations, we share responsibility, in my view, to show that China and the United States can manage our differences, prevent competition from becoming anything ever near conflict.
The world has come to a crossroads. The world expects that China and the United States will properly handle the relationship.
These meetings between heads of state, particularly between the world's largest and second largest economy, should be a very big deal. There should have been a series of smaller meetings between foreign ministers and their deputies that lead up to some type of big deliverable, a nuclear arms reduction treaty, a trade agreement. I don't understand why we're having this meeting, because if Biden is just going to kind of yuck it up, that only plays in the hands of an authoritarian regime that then uses that in their propaganda because they want to be seen as the same level. And the Chinese are famous for lecturing us at these types of meetings.
Our one China policy has not changed. We oppose unilateral change in the status quo by either side, and we're committed to maintaining the peace and stability in the Taiwan Straits. It was also clear that China and the United States should be able to work together where we can to solve global challenges that require every nation to do its part. We discussed Russia's aggression against Ukraine, reaffirmed our shared belief in the threat or the use of nuclear weapons is totally unacceptable, and I asked that Secretary Blinken travel to China to follow up on our discussions and continue keeping the lines of communication open between our two countries.
Rick Riddell, our senior advisor for foreign policy and national security, joining us now. Break down some of this with China now that we're getting more about the meeting that President Biden had. First face-to-face meeting President Biden has had with President Xi. I wanted to play this bite and then get Rick's reaction. It's Joe Biden, bite number 6, just from what was this evening in, I think, Bali, but this morning for us here in the United States, bite 6.
We're going to compete vigorously, but I'm not looking for conflict. I'm looking to manage this competition responsibly. And I want to make sure that every country abides by the international rules of the road. And we discussed that.
So he discussed that, Rick, but we know China is probably the leading country that does not abide by his, quote, rules of the road.
Look, this is laughable to think that somehow there's international rules of the road and that everybody is going to abide by them. That is the strategic mistake of the Biden administration and many Democrats, is they believe in this global order, and then we abide by these climate change limitations, and China and India and Nigeria and all sorts of other countries don't. And so we're getting, the bad end of these negotiations, and we have our head in the sand if we think that somehow other countries are going to abide. This is the opposite of America First, which is consensus with the world and an assumption that somehow other countries are going to play by the rules. Again, Jordan, you know this, our viewers should know this, but I spent 8 years at the UN. I can tell you that unless the United States leads, there is no good policy. We can't just say, global order and everybody abide by the rules.
What do you think about the fact, Rick, that COVID did not come up at all? And this idea that, again, it's something that killed 1 million Americans, millions around the world, and President Biden, when face-to-face with President Xi, wasn't willing to bring it up.
Look, I'm going to say something that's a little bit controversial, but I believe it to be true. The Biden administration and Democrats have benefited from COVID. They've benefited from the political fallout, and they leveraged all of the big rules that they needed in order to win elections and to really manipulate the votes. And what I mean by manipulate the votes, let me be very clear. When you use COVID as an excuse to recklessly send out mail-in ballots, and you send them to people because you say, oh, you can't go to the polls because of COVID, or we need to send these ballots, but then you have unions go door to door and collect these ballots. That is a recipe for disaster. And we should do a whole show on this ballot harvesting issue that has now come up. It's illegal in some states, but it is allowed in other states, and this is a disaster in the making. I don't believe that it's a moral way to do elections, although it is legal in some places. I think it's immoral. But when it comes to COVID, we should have absolutely said to the Chinese, you didn't have the protections around that lab. We know through intelligence that that's where COVID started. You literally wreaked havoc on the world, and we should find a way to punish them for it.
You know, Rick, I want you to take this call because I get why Mel's called in from Colorado on line 1, and I want to let Mel talk. Hey, Mel, welcome to Sekulow. You're on the air.
Well, thanks. I've been listening to your program for many, many years with your dad, going back to the abortion thing back in the 70s and so on. You know, and I'm not a big caller in. I like to listen to the programs, but sure. I just had to call in when you guys questioned about the election results here and the runoff between Walker and Warnock, you know, and I said, I've got to call, you know, I've got to get this thing off my back, you know, and I agree with Rick. There's a lot of things going on that we conservative Republicans have got to take a stand. We can allow these people to continue doing what they're doing. We got to take a stand. There's too many red flags that have gone up, and they say, "Oh, you're an election denier. That's all you're," and you're not. Ask Hillary, you're not, and Abrams, you're not, and you're pointing at us and saying we're election deniers. When things are pointing to some things that are not really legal. Ballots, harvesting, and forcing and paying people for their votes and stuff like that. We know that's happening, but this is happening to a larger degree than most Americans are really aware of, and we need to investigate these things. I don't care what the Democrats say, you know, and it really angers me because we don't do anything. And you said, is this going to cause you to be affected in a negative way with the elections? Yeah, you're done right. I'm a strong Republican. I'm a conservative to the core. But if we keep seeing these things happening, then it just kind of weakens me and weakens me. What's the sense? What's the point?
What's the point of voting, I think is what you're getting at. And Rick, this is what we've kind of touched on at ACLJ, and we've touched on it just while we were talking just then. You know, coming up in Georgia, one thing I said is that, you know, like the laws, don't like the laws, understand the early voting laws, and we need to start banking more votes early. And then we can have that discussion about should that be in place at all? What can we do in the states to, again, continue to ensure election integrity? And I don't like those super early voting states because I feel like people haven't gotten a full picture of who they're voting for yet. But when the law is in place and when you know the parameters of how to stay within the law, I think Republicans, at least for the short term, have better start using to every ability possible to the extent of the law.
Yeah. A couple of rapid points. First of all, Mel, thanks for that call. I think you've got a great point here, and you do have to step up and call and get active and not just sit and listen, so thank you for doing that. I think he's right in the fact that, you know, we're really frustrated. But let's talk about a couple of things. The media are always going to call us a racist, sexist, homophobe, Russian agent, or an election denier. Those are the things. So get comfortable being called names by the media and let it slide off the back. That's the first point. The second point is that we have a terrible problem with ballot harvesting. Again, it's legal, as we pointed out, but I believe it's immoral. We have to be able to change those laws, or we have to abide by the law and do what they're doing, because we have to be very serious about what's going on and be able to put forward our beliefs. I believe that churches are going to have to ballot harvest. If that is exactly what the law is and it's legal, we can't be complaining about it. We're going to have to do that. We can work to change the law, but we have to also recognize that we've got to play hard. Lastly, I'll just say this. It was very disappointing to see the numbers that many Republicans didn't come out to vote in this midterm. That's just a reality. We lost independents big time, and a lot of Republicans didn't come out to vote. I don't know what the answer is. We should do a whole show on listening to callers on why Republicans didn't come out to vote. Did they hear red wave too much and they thought my vote doesn't matter? What is the deal? Why did that happen? We should drill down on that, Jordan. But I have to say, you've got to get out and vote. You have to vote early. You can't just vote on election day. I think that's a mistake to say just vote on election day, because then the weather, or we have some other problems that develop with machines or ink. We had a toner problem in Arizona. So we can't just rely on bombarding election day with our votes. We got to vote earlier. But vote, vote, vote. Do not sit by and allow your country to be taken over by these lefties.
Absolutely, Rick. And we saw that here, even locally. I saw massive lines on election day, and I was one of the people in the lines waiting hours. You start those when you were in hour 2, your mind starts creeping into, I live in a pretty red area. Is this really, I got to get back to my kids. Stuff starts changing, and you do have those things. But also what we talked about in the last segment is, I do think, where Republicans and conservatives maybe laughed at, and some of it rightfully so, some of the social media engagement that the Democrats did with who they invited to the White House, and some of the interviews that they were allowing, and some of these what felt like silly content pieces. They use the influencer culture well. That's something that got missed out, and the conservatives don't really do. We don't really embrace some of this new media quickly, and when that happens is you have a mass majority of the new voters, of the Gen Z voters, coming in and voting Democrat, because they, in some of their platforms where they're getting news and media, there's not even a voice to be heard.
It's such a great point. And ACLJ does a really good job of engaging with young people and trying to do, young people focused education, books and videos. I think that children's books and videos is incredibly important. We have to be able to engage on that social media front. We've done a poor job of doing that.
Rick, moving forward now with just Congress, we don't know the balance of power yet. Still looks like the House. You got another question?
No, so we got 1 minute. Actually.
Yeah, only 1 minute left. Just to give kind of people a little bit of hope and momentum here that, because they need to take that in to Georgia, wherever we live in the country. I know it's kind of election fog, but that's still going to be an important race.
Absolutely. It's an incredibly important race. You should feel good about the fact that we took over the House. Thank God we can stop a lot of these Biden policies. Yes, did we want to win 52, 53 Senate seats? Of course we did. And we came darn close, but we didn't quite do it. I say that we've just always got to maintain this fight. We've got to be better. We got to recognize the media is going to be against us. We got a lot of work to do with suburban women. Let's be honest about that. Yep. Young people and come on, rest up for 2 weeks and get back in the game.
Absolutely, Rick. That's what we'll be doing. Folks, support the work.
Concerned about an issue, we don't just talk about it. We do something about it. And that goes to our Government Accountability Project.
If we allow leaders in Washington, D.C. to make decisions behind closed doors, unaccountable to the people, then we are going to get skewed and corrupt decisions.
There are lots of other places that do lots of important work for America, but the ACLJ has taken up a lane which is irreplaceable.
The Freedom of Information Act, that's a statute that allows us to get information from the government. Starts with a letter from our offices in Washington to these agencies, and it says, give us this information on these topics. And generally, they don't. And then we go to court.
We go through a series of lengthy negotiations back and forth about what they'll give or what they won't give. We may get tons of information that's redacted, and we have to then go back and say, you redacted too much. We can't really find out what you're giving us because it makes no sense. So it goes through a process of litigation.
That is how you get information, and that office is going to be more active now more than ever.
The ACLJ has been extremely active in vigorously seeking to hold these bureaucrats accountable. We have filed hundreds of FOIA requests. We have received over 20,000 pages of documents in our litigation.
Holding them accountable, holding the Biden administration accountable so that all Americans are able to have faith in their government.
We will up our efforts. We will not stop.
You're finding a nugget in a gold mine. Occasionally you'll come up with something that is really a bombshell, but you have to persist in doing it, and that's what we do.
That's a little bit of what we do through our Office of Government Accountability, and of course that comes under our Office of Government Affairs. So your support of the ACLJ supports all of that.
right, welcome back to Sekulow. Final segment of the day. We wanted to hear from you, and you've called in 1-800-684-3110. Let's just start with how people have been holding on the line. So we'll start first with Pat in Texas on line 2. Hey, Pat.
Thank you so much for letting me on your show, and
Sure.
God bless you guys. Really appreciate you. So my deal is, because the Democrats are wanting to count these votes, what are they trying to push through at the 11th hour, basically, while they're holding back where we can be able to see the results?
Well,
that's all I wanted to know.
Listen, they have control of Congress till January. They have the House and the Senate.
Right.
They could get rid of the filibuster. They could codify Roe. They could pass more crazy spending legislation. That has nothing to do with the vote counting. Ultimately, this vote counting has to be done. Technically, it has to be certified in December. But usually we know much longer before that. Some of us, we're just learning election law as we go through this process, is that oftentimes we thought, on election day, those members of Congress don't go right to Washington, D.C. who won and take the oath. That won't be until January. So they'll be preparing.
Some kind of orientation. I think they have those.
Yeah, they start that after Thanksgiving to get prepared so they can staff up. But you can imagine how difficult it is to staff up when you're not even sure if you're going to be in the majority or the minority, because the funds are differently spent. Who's going to be chairman of committees? Who is going to have that committee staff? Those expert staff. It's unclear right now in the House. Unfortunately, it is clear in the Senate. So it's not so much. They always have this session, Pat, where regardless of the outcome, they still go back to Washington and they can pass some serious stuff. We're going to be on that and tracking very closely what they may be up to. So I appreciate you bringing that up to remind people that the current Democrat majority of the House and the Senate is still very much active for a couple more months.
Yeah, and maybe emboldened even more so.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them are on their way out who have retired or did lose. And because of that, they're not going to be as, I worry very much about the codification of Roe into our federal law.
Yeah, because that's tough. It's tough. I mean,
they'd have to get rid of the filibuster to do it.
And it makes you very upset, the fact that they would take a Supreme Court case and do that, but nothing is beyond. Like you said, they're going to use everything they could do that's in their legal, at least, powers to get done. We'll continue on calls.
Yeah, let's go to Michael in Texas on line 3. Hey, Michael.
How are you? Thanks for taking my call. I just don't think we should leave the focus of making sure Walker wins the Senate in Georgia, because we could find ourselves with a senator somewhere in the country that leaves the Democratic Party and will vote Republican, similar to Tulsi Gabbard. That's a prominent Democrat that has left the party because of their radical policies, and there could be enough pressure on a state senator to go ahead and make that move.
Well, here's where, first of all, we love Tulsi. Tulsi no longer in Congress and was not in the Senate. Here's where I think it becomes difficult if Herschel loses. Why would they give up the power of being in the majority?
Yeah, at the end of the day, a lot of this is a game.
One is not going to flip it.
This is a game.
So if we could convince one, Michael, great, but it wouldn't flip it unless you'd have to have Herschel win and flip one.
It also feels like, look, we think, obviously the hope is that Herschel can pull it out still, regardless. But when you look at it,
I don't want to give up hope. I'm just saying that's pretty. That's up.
You're going for a theory that I think a lot of people with Manchin and with Sinema and these people
never happen.
It's always like this rabbit that you're chasing that you never can quite get. That this person is going to flip, and it just doesn't happen very much. Not that it can't, but it would be shocking, as you said, coming out of an election where there wasn't the red wave, the red tsunami, or any of these terms that are being thrown around. When that didn't happen, that would be tough. But Michael, thank you. Appreciate it. Obviously, Tulsi Gabbard, if you want to say, last week she had our dad on our podcast. You should go take a listen to that. It's a good episode. If you want to get actually a really good history of the organization of what we do here, that's a good one to go to.
And we're doing a podcast today.
We do. Sekulow Brothers podcast will be on later today.
A little lighter?
I hope so. We usually have a more casual, informal conversation. We'll be doing that this afternoon, so make sure you're following us on all your favorite social media platforms, but also mainly make sure you're subscribed on Apple Podcasts and you're subscribed on Rumble. Those are kind of our two big outlets. We're also on YouTube, but you can find all the links at SekulowBrothers.com. We'll take some more calls.
Yeah, because it's a big day at ACLJ here at this office. Mike Pompeo's going to be here today.
Yeah.
Later on in the afternoon, we're going to film some special stuff with him.
Yeah, it'll air later this week, and a lot of stuff that you'll see in the future.
That'll be cool as well. Let's take some more calls.
All right, let's go to Richard in Georgia on line 1. Richard, welcome.
Hey, guys. Thanks for taking my call. came up a while ago about Republican voters. Well, I know that just don't want to vote anymore because Republicans don't do anything. They get in power. They're afraid of the media. They're afraid. I mean, look what they had, you know, when Obama, we had a Congress. Didn't do anything. Even when Trump was president, they didn't do anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think, listen, margins matter. There were some massive tax cuts under Trump, so I say they didn't do anything. Yeah. I mean, remember, it was only a couple of years like that, and then you get hit with the Democrat takeover. So remind yourself, remember, Republicans come in, especially if a Democrat is president, and we have one of the houses, the first job is to stop legislation. The second is then to see if you can get anything done in a bipartisan way. That's going to become that much more difficult with a left Senate and potentially a conservative House and a left president. But again, just I would not give up on voting. If you give up on voting, we can never win.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's no chance. Zero
and
chance.
They're doubling down on voting.
Right, because
they've already curated a whole new group of young voters that never used to vote before, who, like you said, Logan, feel pressure, not necessarily from like the traditional lines of party politics, but from influencers online that they follow and celebrities they follow.
There's a fall in line.
To say, you know what? I need my vote sticker.
Yeah, I need to get engaged. Yeah, I need to have something to share.
Right.
It gives you another thing to share. Let's go ahead and try to take at least one more call. Which one do you want to go with?
You pick.
All right, let's go to Alex, who's calling in North Carolina. Alex, you're on the air.
Thank you very much for taking my call. I know of strong Republican women that voted straight Democrat simply because they did not understand the truth about abortion.
Yeah, I think that is a problem that happened across the country.
And it was much bigger than it was polling. It polled high earlier this summer, then it started dropping off the polls to like number 4 and 5 issue. Ended up being the second biggest issue in the country, just 4 points behind the economy. Listen, I'll tell you this, and maybe you agree, maybe you don't. As someone who's worked in the pro-life world since I was born, I would easily give up, a branch of Congress to see Roe versus Wade overturned.
Absolutely.
We're talking about a midterm election here, not a general election, but a midterm election. If we could keep the House, and it was because of overturning Roe versus Wade that we lost the Senate, that's okay with me long term, because the long-term battle, that's a bigger deal. Now, what else do we need to do? We know we need to double down on education. We're going to be doing that at the ACLJ. Obviously, even in Herschel's race to some extent, we're going to be focusing on early voting in that race and just getting more people to utilize that process in a bipartisan way through ACLJ. Just say, don't be afraid of early voting.
Yeah.
Get out and use it. Bank votes.
Yeah, you heard Rick Grinnell talk about it. If you hear somebody like him talking about it, you know that these are people who obviously have been on the front lines of the election stuff. They're telling you to go early vote. Definitely get engaged.
Yeah. So, folks, and again, I don't want you to be down. I think this is part of politics. I will tell you, when you work closely in it, like I have my entire life, honestly, you end up losing more than you would. And that's because these votes are right on the margin. We told you there would only be a red wave if we won these very close races. We just ended up not winning the very close races. The ones we were down 2 and 3 points, we lost by 2 or 3 points. Let's keep up hope that we take back the House. That looks pretty good. And we'll stay updated with you, but support the work of the ACLJ financially at aclj.org. We got our matching challenge. Donate today if you can.